The war was over. After years of bloodshed between humanity and the Zerathian Empire, the final battle had ended with the human forces claiming victory. The once mighty palace of the Zerathian rulers now stood in ruins, its grand halls filled with the heavy footsteps of human soldiers. Captain Adrian Voss walked through the shattered remains of the imperial court, his expression unreadable. He had fought in this war for years, watched countless men fall, and yet, standing here now, he felt no triumph. The palace was eerily silent. No more battle cries, no more explosions, only the sound of flickering torches and the distant hum of warships hovering above. At the center of the throne room, the defeated Zerathian royal family stood in chains. Their proud silver armor was dented, their violet eyes filled with exhaustion. Among them, Princess Lyraya, the only daughter of Emperor Zarvos, stood tall despite her captivity. A delicate veil covered her face, a traditional sign of mourning in Zerathian culture. Adrian's orders were clear: secure the royal family and prepare them for transport. The human high command had not yet decided what to do with the remaining Zerathian leaders. Some whispered about exile, others about execution. Adrian didn't care. He was just a soldier following orders. His gaze locked onto Lyraya as he approached. There was something about her, something familiar. The princess stood still, her golden cuffs glowing faintly with the restraints that blocked her energy-based abilities. She watched Adrian carefully, her mind racing as she listened to his voice, the way he commanded his soldiers. It triggered something deep within her, a memory from long ago, from a time before the war. No, it can't be him. Lyraya's heart pounded in her chest. Could this human captain, the very man who led the final battle against her people, be the boy she once knew? Years ago, before the war, before the hatred between their species, there was a time when she had a friend. A young human boy with sharp green eyes, a boy who was kind, curious, and different from the others. And now, standing before her, was that same boy, but now he was a man, a warrior, a conqueror. Adrian noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the way her fingers twitched as if wanting to reach out, but holding back. He had faced many enemies in his life, but never before had he seen one look at him with such recognition. Why is she looking at me like that? He wondered. For a moment, the war, the victory, and the broken palace all faded into the background. The past had returned, but neither of them knew what to do with it. Princess Lyraya's heart pounded as she stood before Captain Adrian Voss. The war was over, her people had lost, and she was now a prisoner. But none of that mattered at this moment. Could it really be him? The human captain, the man who led the army that brought down her father's empire, looked so familiar. His green eyes, his sharp features, his voice. She had seen him before. She knew him. Adrian noticed the way she stared at him. There was something strange about her gaze, almost as if she was searching for something in his face. It was not fear, not hatred, but something else. Move them to the holding chambers, he ordered his men, but his voice was slightly distracted. As the guards led Lyraya away, she hesitated for just a second before whispering, "Do you remember Varian 5? Adrian's body tensed. The name struck something deep inside him, like a ghost from the past whispering in his ear. Varian 5. It was a small, neutral colony world. Many years ago, his family had lived there for a short time before war broke out. He remembered warm sunsets, endless green fields, and someone else. A girl. A Zerathian girl with silver eyes. A childhood friend. His mind tried to grasp the memory, but it felt distant, just out of reach. He had been so young back then. And now, he was a soldier, a captain in the human fleet, and she was the daughter of the enemy's ruler. It was impossible. Adrian turned sharply, looking at Lyraya as the guards escorted her away. Was she telling the truth? Was she really the girl from his past? That night, in the silence of his private quarters, Adrian pulled up old records from his military database. He searched through colony archives, old records of Varian 5. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the list of Zerethian families who had once lived there. And then he found it. Lyraya Zarvos, daughter of Emperor Zarvos, a child once raised in peace before the war tore everything apart. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. It was true. The alien princess, the enemy, the prisoner of war, was the same girl he once called his friend. Memories flooded back, running through the fields, laughing under the twin moons, sharing dreams of a future where humans and Zerethians could live in harmony. And now they were on opposite sides of history. Adrian clenched his fists. What was he supposed to do with this truth? And more importantly, what did Lyraya want from him now? The next day, as Adrian moved through the ruins of the Zerethian palace, he couldn't shake the memory of Lyraya's words. "Do you remember Varian 5? The question echoed in his mind, leaving him restless and confused. He tried to focus on the task at hand, making sure the palace was secure, overseeing the transfer of prisoners, and ensuring the war was officially over. But nothing seemed as important as that question. Later that afternoon, Adrian found himself standing outside the holding cells where Lyraya was being kept. The guards nodded to him as he approached, but he ignored them, his eyes focused on the cell where she sat. She was still wearing the same veils that covered her face, hiding her emotions. But Adrian could tell there was something different in the way she carried herself now. Lyraya's eyes flickered up as he approached. Her silver gaze met his, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world outside their small space disappeared. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He had seen that gaze before, years ago, but never like this. Never through the eyes of the enemy. "You're still here," Adrian said softly, stepping closer to the bars that separated them. Lyraya stood up, her movement graceful despite the chains that bound her wrists. "I have nowhere else to go." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet strength. Adrian didn't know what to say next. The words felt stuck in his throat. How did you talk to someone you once considered a friend, now that they were on opposite sides of a war? How did he face the girl he had known, the girl who was now his enemy? "You were just a child," Adrian said, trying to make sense of it all. I don't understand. How did everything change so fast?" Lyraya's lips tightened as she walked closer, her hands resting against the cold metal of the bars. "You think I don't know what this war cost?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think I don't feel the weight of it every day? We were the same once. And now I'm nothing but a prisoner." Adrian's heart clenched. He had never considered it from her perspective. For him, it had always been about the mission, the war, the victory. But for Lyraya, it was about loss of her home, her family, and the childhood she once had. "I remember," she continued, her silver eyes locking onto his, "the starlit fields of Varian 5. I remember running through them with you, laughing. But it feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?" Adrian nodded, his throat tight. It felt like a lifetime ago. He could still see the way she had smiled, the way they had promised to stay friends no matter what. How had it all come to this? "You changed," Adrian finally said, his voice quiet. "I don't know when, but you did." "And so did you," Lyraya replied. "You're not the same boy I knew." The words hit Adrian harder than he expected. The truth was, he wasn't the same boy. The war had changed him. It had made him someone who followed orders, someone who fought without hesitation. But standing here now, facing the girl he had once known, Adrian couldn't help but wonder, what had the war done to her? Lyraya looked away for a moment, then returned her gaze to him. "You don't have to be my enemy, Adrian. Not really. We still have a choice." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Was it possible? Could they really find a way back to who they once were? Or was the past lost forever? Adrian sat in his quarters later that evening, unable to shake off the conversation with Lyraya. Her words lingered in his mind, echoing through the silence of the room. "You don't have to be my enemy, Adrian." Not really. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had spoken, the way her eyes had looked at him. For the first time since the war began, Adrian questioned everything he thought he knew. It was hard to believe that the girl he had known on Varian 5, the one he had played in the fields with, the one he had laughed with, could now be standing before him as the enemy. Had it all really changed so much? Had the war transformed everything they had once shared into something unrecognizable? He stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner, searching through old records on Varian 5. It had been years since he'd thought about that place, the peaceful colony where his family had lived for a short time. He remembered the long summer days, the warmth of the sun, and the innocence of his childhood. But more than that, he remembered Luraya. Scrolling through the files, Adrian found what he was looking for, a record of Zerethian settlers on Varian 5. His finger traced down the list until it landed on Zerathian family Zarvos. It was her. Luraya Zarvos. The same girl, the same childhood friend who had once smiled at him under the twin moons. The same girl who now stood before him, wearing the veil of an enemy princess. The realization hit him like a wave. But what did that mean now? What could he do with this knowledge? He couldn't simply ignore the war. He couldn't forget what had happened, the lives lost, the cities destroyed. He had been part of the fight, but she had been a part of his past, someone he had cared for before all the pain began. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he called, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over him. The door creaked open, and standing there was General Kieran, his commanding officer. His cold, calculating eyes scanned Adrian's face. "Captain Voss," he began, his tone businesslike, "I need you to lead the interrogation of the royal family. The higher-ups are expecting results." Adrian nodded slowly, his mind still tangled with thoughts of Luraya. He had been so focused on the mission, the victory, and the orders he had followed. But now, it all felt different. Did the mission still matter to him the same way? Did it matter if Luraya was the enemy or if she was the girl he had once known? "I'll get to it, sir," Adrian said, pushing his emotions aside. But the truth was, he didn't feel the same anymore. After the general left, Adrian sat back down, staring at the file on his desk. The words on the paper seemed to blur, fading into a world he no longer understood. The truth was, he didn't want to be the enemy anymore. He didn't want to fight her. But what could he do? The war had changed everything. Could they find a way back to who they once were? Or was it too late? The days that followed were a blur for Adrian Voss. He did his duties mechanically, interrogating prisoners, overseeing the movement of supplies, and reporting to his superiors. But his mind kept drifting back to Luraya, to the girl from his past. His orders had been clear: interrogate the royal family, find out their secrets, and make sure no threats remained. But as Adrian sat in the darkened interrogation room, staring at the cold metal table, he couldn't stop thinking about what Luraya had said. Her words had stayed with him, especially the way she described the war. "You think I don't know what this war cost?" she had said, and Adrian realized she was right. The war had cost both sides so much: lives, families, homes. Yet it had all started because of a lie that had made humans and Zerethians enemies, turning friends into strangers. Adrian had never thought much about the reasons behind the war. To him, it had always been about survival, about protecting humanity. But Luraya's words made him question everything. Why had it all started in the first place? One evening, after another long day of orders and military reports, Adrian found himself in the palace archives. He had slipped away from his commanding officers, unable to focus on anything else. The silence of the vast library was soothing, but it only made the questions in his mind grow louder. What was the truth? He began searching through old documents from the Zerathian Empire, records of the peace talks, and accounts of past conflicts. Hours passed, and finally he found what he was looking for. A damning report that revealed the truth about the war's origins. The human attack on the Zerathian embassy, which had sparked the war, was a setup. A group of Zerathian conspirators, aiming to take power for themselves, had staged the attack and blamed it on humans. The Empire's leaders, including Laraya's father, had been manipulated into believing it was an act of war. Adrian's hands shook as he read the report. The war had been based on a lie. The destruction, the pain, the loss. It had all been for nothing. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The human forces hadn't attacked out of malice. They had been tricked, just like the Zerathians. Both sides had been manipulated by those who wanted to keep the conflict going for their own gain. But now, as the war was coming to an end, Adrian saw the truth clearly. His whole life, his whole mission had been built on lies. And Laraya had been right. The report made Adrian's blood boil. How could they have been so easily deceived? He felt betrayed, not just by the Zerathian conspirators, but by his own people. How could humanity have fallen for such a deception? He stood up, suddenly aware of the weight of the decision in front of him. Adrian had been part of this war, part of the lie. But now he had the power to change it. He could expose the truth and end the cycle of hatred and violence that had consumed them all. The thought of confronting his commanders, of going against everything he had been taught, filled him with dread. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had no choice. The truth needed to be told. Adrian walked out of the archives, his mind made up. He would not follow orders blindly anymore. He would confront the past and do whatever it took to bring peace. But first, he needed to speak to Laraya. She had known the truth all along, and perhaps together, they could end the war once and for all. The palace was quiet that night. Adrian Voss paced in his quarters, the weight of his decision pressing on him. He couldn't sleep. His mind raced, filled with the same thoughts over and over. He had uncovered the truth, the lie that had sparked the war. But what would he do with it? The human military was still set on controlling the Zerathian Empire, and exposing the truth might be seen as treason. Would he risk everything, his career, his life, for what was right? He had to. The thought of facing his superiors filled him with unease. General Karen had been adamant about keeping control over the conquered planets. Peace didn't seem to be a priority, not to the higher-ups. The war was over, but that didn't mean the soldiers would go home. They had their victory, and they intended to hold on to it. The military had its own plans for the future. Adrian knew he had to act before the truth was buried under the weight of political games. The Zerathian royal family was still locked away in their cells, and Laraya was among them, her fate uncertain. He had to find a way to protect her, to stop the violence from continuing. She deserved the truth as much as he did. That evening after his patrol, Adrian made his way back to the holding chambers. The guards let him through without question. He was a captain, after all. He stood outside Laraya's cell, his heart pounding. He knew he had to speak with her again. He couldn't do this alone. When Laraya saw him, her eyes flickered with surprise, then something else, perhaps hope. She stood up from her cot, brushing the dark strands of hair from her face. "What is it, Captain?" Her voice was cautious, but her gaze was steady. "I found something," Adrian said, his voice low. "The war, it was a lie. Both of our sides were deceived." Laraya's eyes widened, and she stepped forward, her silver eyes locking onto his. "A lie? What do you mean?" "The human attack that started the war. It was staged," Adrian explained. "A group of Zerathian conspirators set it up. They wanted to start a war, and they framed humanity for it. Your father, he was tricked. The attack never happened the way we were told. It was all a lie, Laraya. We've all been pawns in someone else's game." For a long moment, Laraya didn't say anything. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if to see if he was truly telling the truth. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of their words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I knew something didn't feel right. What I didn't know. I didn't know who to trust. Adrian nodded, feeling the same confusion gnawing at him. I don't know how we've gotten this far, how we let the war go on for so long. But now, I want to fix it. I want to stop the violence. But I can't do it alone. Larea stepped closer to the bars, her eyes filled with emotion. You're not alone, Adrian. She said it softly, but it felt like a promise. I'm with you. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He had been prepared for resistance, for anger, even for rejection. But instead, Larea's words brought him hope. She wasn't his enemy anymore. Perhaps they were never enemies to begin with. The truth needs to be exposed, Adrian said, his voice firm. The world needs to know the truth. We can't let them control us any longer, not like this. Larea nodded. But we're not the only ones who have power. The High Command, the people who started this war, they still hold the cards. If we want to expose the truth, we have to be smart. We have to find a way to unite the galaxy, not divide it. Adrian looked at her, admiration and respect growing in his chest. They could do this together. The war had brought them here, but it didn't have to define them. They had a choice now, a choice to stop the violence, to change the future. He took a deep breath, a new sense of determination filling him. We'll find a way. Together. The night air was thick with tension as Adrian and Larea huddled in a small, dimly lit room deep within the palace. The guards had passed by earlier, but Adrian knew it wouldn't be long before they noticed his absence. He had to be quick. We don't have much time, Adrian said, his voice low but urgent. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. We can't stay here. If we want to expose the truth, we have to move fast. Larea stood by the table, her face serious. I know, but we can't just walk out of here unnoticed. They're watching every move. Adrian looked at her, feeling a mix of frustration and admiration. She had been the princess, the daughter of the emperor, and now she was a prisoner. Yet despite everything, she remained calm and determined. We need a plan, Adrian said, his voice quieter now. And we need help. We can't do this alone. Larea nodded slowly. I have contacts, loyalists from my father's time. They're scattered, but they still believe in the old ways, in the possibility of peace between our peoples. I can reach out to them. Adrian's eyes widened. You still have people who trust you. They never left me. Even after the war started, they believed in what my father tried to build, she explained. But it's risky. If we're caught, it's over. Adrian walked over to the small desk in the corner, his fingers brushing over the data pad that had been left there. The documents he had found earlier had made him certain of one thing. The war had been built on lies, and the truth needed to be heard. But that truth wouldn't matter if they couldn't escape the palace and get it into the right hands. Then we'll make sure we're not caught, Adrian said, determination in his voice. We'll move fast, and we'll be careful. He paused, looking back at Larea. Are you sure about this? You're risking everything. If we fail. If we fail, Larea interrupted, her voice strong. Then nothing changes. The war will go on. My people will suffer. Your people will suffer. And for what? A lie? I won't let that happen. Her words hit Adrian harder than he expected. He knew she was right. But there was still fear gnawing at him. The stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, and it would all be over. The human forces would hunt them down, and any hope for peace would be lost. But despite the fear, Adrian felt something else. Hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger. All right, he said, his voice steady. We do this together. Larea nodded, a small, determined smile crossing her lips. We'll need to leave tonight. I'll make contact with the loyalists, and we'll set up a meeting. If they're still willing to help, they'll come. Adrian's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He knew that if they could expose the truth, they could end the war and bring about a real change. But it was all so fragile. They had to move quickly, and they had to trust each other completely. Once we get to them, we'll have to make sure the message reaches the right people, Adrian said. We can't just send it to the military leaders. We need to get it to the citizens, to the ones who will believe in peace. Loreda's eyes gleamed. We will. I'll make sure of it. Together, they gathered what little they'd had. Adrian grabbed his jacket, while Loreda quickly disguised herself to avoid being recognized. They moved swiftly through the dark hallways of the palace, knowing that their time was running out. Every step they took brought them closer to freedom, but also closer to danger. Adrian took one last look at the palace before they slipped out into the night. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance, and for the first time in a long while, Adrian felt like he was doing the right thing. The cold night air hit Adrian's face as he and Loreda slipped through the palace's back exit, careful not to make a sound. Their footsteps echoed softly in the silent corridors, the only sound accompanying them in the shadowed halls. Adrian's heart raced with the knowledge that they were no longer just running from the enemy. They were fighting for something bigger. Stay close, Adrian whispered, glancing back to make sure Loreda was behind him. She nodded, her dark eyes sharp and focused, despite the fear creeping through her. The night was their only cover. They had no time to waste. They had to reach the hidden starship Loreda's loyalists had arranged for their escape. It was the only way to leave the palace undetected. Adrian had been a soldier all his life, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of mission. There was no battlefield, no orders from above, no backup. Just the two of them, running through the dark, hoping their plan wouldn't fall apart. Loreda's hand brushed his arm lightly, a signal to slow down. Adrian stopped, his instincts on high alert. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the stillness before something happened. The guards, she whispered, her eyes narrowing. Adrian quickly scanned the hall ahead. 2 guards stood in front of the main doors leading to the outer courtyard, chatting quietly. Their backs were turned. This was their chance. Adrian motioned for Loreda to follow him as they quickly crouched and moved to the side. The shadows hid them, their movements swift and silent. They pressed against the cold walls, hearts pounding in sync. They couldn't afford a mistake. One sound, one wrong step, and everything would fall apart. As they neared the corner, Adrian stopped, holding up his hand. He leaned in close to Loreda. We need to get past them. Stay low, stay quiet. Follow my lead. Loreda nodded without hesitation. Adrian felt a sense of determination from her. She wasn't the princess locked away in a palace anymore. She was a survivor, just like him. They waited for the guards to turn their backs again before moving forward. With perfect timing, they darted across the open space between them and the door, sliding into the hidden passageway behind it just as the guards turned around. Adrian breathed a quiet sigh of relief. They were out of the palace, but their journey had only just begun. The next step was reaching the hidden ship. They had only a narrow window of time to board before the palace was locked down for the night. If they didn't make it, they would be trapped, and there would be no escape. We're almost there, Adrian said, his voice steady but his mind racing. Loreda looked at him, her eyes filled with silent gratitude. I didn't think you'd come for me. Adrian didn't answer right away. He couldn't. It wasn't about whether he'd come for her. It was about doing what was right. No matter what their past was, they were both standing on the edge of a future that could change everything. They had both been betrayed by the war, but now they had a chance to stop it. They finally reached the edge of the palace grounds. The starship was hidden behind a large rock formation, its sleek black body almost invisible in the dark. It was a small vessel, just enough to carry them out of Zerathian-controlled space. Let's go, Adrian said. They ran for the ship, adrenaline pushing them forward. Just as they reached the ramp, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. The guards had noticed they were gone. Adrian turned, his eyes locked on the approaching soldiers. There was no turning back now. They had to make this escape, no matter the cost. "Go," Adrian shouted. Loraya ran ahead, her feet barely touching the ground as she climbed up into the ship. Adrian followed her, slamming the hatch shut behind them just as the soldiers reached the ramp. The ship's engines roared to life. Adrian looked at Loraya, his heart pounding. "We're out," he said, a small smile breaking through his tense expression. As the ship shot into the sky, leaving the palace and the war behind, Adrian knew one thing. They hadn't just escaped. They had started something bigger. The fight for the truth had begun. As the ship soared higher, the lights of the Zerethian capital fading behind them, Adrian felt a strange mix of relief and fear. They were finally free from the palace, but the real work was just beginning. The galaxy was still in turmoil, and the truth they carried was powerful, but dangerous. Loraya sat next to him in the small cockpit, her eyes focused on the stars outside. The calmness in her demeanor helped steady Adrian's nerves. She had once been a princess, the future of an empire, and now she was a fugitive, just like him. Yet, in her quiet determination, she seemed stronger than ever. "What happens now?" Adrian asked, his voice low, breaking the silence between them. Loraya glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Now we find the people who can help us spread the truth. We can't just take it to the military. They won't listen. We need to go to the people, the ones who still believe in peace." Adrian nodded. The war had left a deep scar on both sides, and the last thing he wanted was to let the people suffer any longer. The galaxy had been tricked into fighting for years. Now they had a chance to bring peace, but only if they could expose the truth. "Where do we start?" Adrian asked. Loraya pointed to the star chart displayed on the ship's console. "There's a neutral world called Varian 7, just outside Zerathian space. It's home to many who rejected the war from the beginning. It's our best chance to find allies who can help us." Adrian studied the map, memorizing the coordinates. He had no illusions about how dangerous the journey would be. Even with the truth in their hands, they were still fugitives, hunted by both humans and Zerathians. But they had no choice. The galaxy needed to know what had really happened. The next few hours passed in tense silence as they traveled through space, with only the hum of the ship's engines breaking the stillness. Adrian couldn't help but think of everything they had left behind: the palace, the soldiers, the war. He had been part of it all, fighting for victory, believing in the mission. But now, that mission seemed hollow. He had fought for a lie. Loraya turned to him, sensing his thoughts. "You didn't know. None of us did." Adrian nodded slowly, his hands gripping the controls. "I should have figured it out earlier. I should have questioned things sooner." "You can't change the past," Loraya said gently. "But you can change what happens next. We both can." Her words were a reminder that they weren't alone in this. They were in it together, and together they could find a way to set things right. As the stars stretched out before them, Adrian felt a spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the escape or the truth they carried. It was the feeling that they were fighting for something bigger, something worth fighting for. "We'll make it," Adrian said quietly. Loraya smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. "We will." They both turned their attention to the stars ahead, the unknown future waiting for them. The war had taken so much from them, but now they had a chance to make it right. They would find the allies they needed, expose the truth, and bring peace. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Adrian felt ready to face it. They were no longer enemies. They were allies, and together they would change the galaxy. The journey to Varian 7 took longer than Adrian and Loraya had hoped. The stars outside the ship were distant, and the endless stretch of space seemed to weigh down on them. Every hour felt like a day, every minute like a lifetime. But there was no turning back. They had made a choice to expose the truth, to end the war, and to try and fix what had been broken. As they entered the outer orbit of Varian 7, the calmness of space seemed to settle over them, if only for a moment. The planet below was a peaceful, neutral world, far from the war that had torn apart the galaxy. Here, Adrian hoped they could find the support they needed, people who still believed in the possibility of peace. Larea studied the planet below, her silver eyes reflecting the blue and green surface of the world. "We should land near the capital," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "I have contacts there. They'll help us." Adrian nodded, trusting her judgment. "Let's do it." The ship touched down in a small, secluded area outside the capital, hidden from prying eyes. As the engines powered down, Adrian felt a sense of urgency settle over him. They had arrived, but now came the hardest part. They had to convince people who had lived through the war, who had suffered like everyone else, that the fight had been a lie. "Stay low," Adrian said, looking over at Larea. "We don't know who's watching." They exited the ship, their feet making soft thuds on the rocky ground as they made their way toward the city. The air was cool, the streets empty, like a quiet, forgotten place. Adrian couldn't help but wonder how many others had seen the same things he had, how many others were hiding their own truths. But right now, they had to focus on the mission. They reached the capital center, where they met with an old contact of Laraya's, Marin, a leader of the underground movement that had fought against the war from the start. Marin was a tall man, his face weathered by years of resistance, but there was a fire in his eyes as he listened to Larea and Adrian's story. "You're telling me," Marin said, "that everything, the war, the deaths, the destruction, it was all based on a lie." Adrian nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "Yes, we've found the evidence. There's proof." The attack on the Zerathian embassy, it was staged by a group of conspirators. They manipulated both our people and yours into fighting. Marin was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching their faces. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you. I've always known there was something wrong with the war. Too many people suffered, too many innocent lives lost. If what you're saying is true, then we have to expose it." Larea stepped forward, her voice firm. "We need to get the message out. It has to reach everyone. The military, the citizens, the leaders. The truth must come out." Marin looked at them both, his face set with determination. "We'll help you. We'll broadcast it, get it to every corner of the galaxy. But it won't be easy. There will be those who try to silence us." Adrian felt a deep sense of relief. They had found allies, real allies, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that they might actually succeed in ending this war. Not with more fighting, but with the truth. Larea turned to Adrian, her eyes soft but strong. "We've come this far. Now we finish what we started." Adrian nodded, his heart filled with purpose. Together, the truth would set them free, but it would also change everything. For the first time, Adrian believed in the possibility of peace, and with Larea at his side, he knew they could make it happen. The war had been built on lies, but now, with the truth in their hands, they would rewrite the future.